Welcome back to Slave Trade Narratives, the Elizabeth Donnan Project. I'm your host, Dat Work, and in this episode, our second, we move beyond Portugal to examine the next imperial power to enter the Atlantic slave trade, Spain. If Chapter 1 taught us how the slave trade began, crafted through the convergence of empire, religion, and commerce, then Chapter 2 shows us how that blueprint spread. The forces that Portugal unleashed didn't stop at its borders. They were watched, studied, and soon replicated by its powerful neighbor across the Iberian Peninsula. Today we're examining the role of Spain in the 15th and early 16th centuries, especially how it used its expanding empire in the Caribbean and Central America to become not only a user of enslaved African labor, but a major logistical player in developing its transatlantic system. Elizabeth Donnan opens this chapter not in Lisbon, but in Seville, the Spanish city that would become a central hub for the colonial administration. From Seville, orders would be issued, captives processed, and routes established to new Spanish colonies in the Americas. The documents she compiles begin to show a shift in scale and scope. While Portugal pioneered the trade along the African coast, it is Spain that begins to test how slavery will operate in the New World. But to understand what's happening in Donnan's documents, we need to look at the broader political and religious landscape of Spain in the late 15th century. In 1492, the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella completed the Reconquista, reclaiming the final Muslim stronghold of Granada. That same year, they expelled the Jews from Spain and sent Christopher Columbus westward in search of trade routes to India. What they found instead, at least from their perspective, was a world full of souls to convert, land to extract, and wealth to seize. This convergence, military victory, religious purification, and imperial ambition created the perfect storm for a new kind of colonization. The Spanish crown had already witnessed Portugal's success along the African coast and didn't intend to be left behind. Here's where Donnan's documentation becomes crucial. Chapter 2 includes royal decrees, church statements, and colonial reports that show how Spain began experimenting with native labor. And when that failed, or when mortality overwhelmed population, African slavery stepped in to fill the void. One of the earliest documents she includes is a letter from King Ferdinand to the governor of Hispaniola, which is modern-day Dominican Republic and Haiti, and it's dated 1503, and the letter reads, and I quote, "It is our will that you send certain Negroes for the service of the island, so that the Indians be not overburdened and fall into decline," end quote. This line is a turning point, ladies and gentlemen. It frames the importation of Africans not as a violent act, but as a humanitarian intervention. The narrative suggests that enslaving Africans is preferable to overworking indigenous populations. But of course, no one in the system was free. What we're seeing is a shift in the burden of bondage, from native bodies to African bodies. This early justification will appear again and again in European documents, that Africans are better suited to labor, more resilient, more natural for enslavement. These are the roots of modern racial ideology, and they grow directly out of Spanish imperial necessity. Donnan also includes fragments of Spanish ecclesiastical writings, showing how priests and bishops responded to the growing moral dilemma. One Franciscan friar in 1511, Antonio de Montesinos, famously denounced the treatment of the Indians in a sermon. And I quote, "Tell me by what right or justice do you keep these Indians in such cruel and horrible servitude?" End quote. But Donnan's chapter 2 makes clear that Montesinos' critique was limited to indigenous suffering. His sermons rarely addressed African slavery, which was already becoming normalized by 1515. And by the time Bartolomé de las Casas, another early reformer, suggested that importing Africans instead of using native labor, the ideological door was flung wide open. In a passage Donnan includes from Las Casas in 1543, states, and I quote, "I thought it would be better to use Negroes who have been accustomed to hard labor than to destroy the natives who are gentle and weak." End quote. Las Casas would later regret this suggestion, but the damage was done. His words were taken as permission, even encouragement, to scale up African importation into Spanish colonies. Here again, we see the pattern, ladies and gentlemen, of the language of concern becoming the logic of oppression. I'll repeat that. The language of concern becomes the logic of oppression. To save one people, another is sacrificed. Donnan's chapter 2 shows us how these moral acrobatics become embedded in colonial legislation. In one decree issued by Charles V in 1518, Donnan records the authorization of licenses to bring African slaves directly from Africa to the New World, bypassing Spain. And ladies and gentlemen, this marks the first official sanction of transatlantic slave shipments on a large scale. The document reads, and I quote, "We have permitted the sending of 4,000 Negroes to the Indies for the service of our subjects." And there it is, ladies and gentlemen. Service. Not labor, not bondage, but service. The rhetoric continues to soften the reality. These were not volunteers. They were not workers. They were enslaved. And yet documents Donnan includes show a relentless effort to make that reality palatable through terminology, through religion, and through law. So let me say this clearly. By the early 1500s, Spain was no longer experimenting. It was institutionalizing. And in the next segment, I'll explore how this institutionalization played out in the colonies, on the ground, in the ports, and in the lives of the enslaved. And how Donnan's sources begin to map the early geography of the Atlantic trade from Africa to the Caribbean. Stay with me for part 2, From Spain to the Indies, Logistics of the Early Slave Economy. As the Spanish crown authorized the movement of enslaved Africans from the ports of West Africa to the New World colonies, something began to solidify. Something more than routes and regulations. A transatlantic infrastructure was forming. In Donnan's chapter 2, we begin to see the logistical skeleton of slavery, the permits, the ports, the provisioning systems that would define centuries of bondage. Spain, once uncertain about its use of African labor, was now orchestrating a system to move thousands of people across the ocean, not just as bodies, but as economic inputs. Let me return to the 1518 decree by Charles V, a monarch who ruled not only Spain, but much of the Holy Roman Empire. This decree allowed licensed traders to import enslaved Africans directly into Spanish colonies. Prior to this, enslaved people were often brought from Spain itself, having first been processed or Christianized in Iberian cities like Seville. Now Spain was opening the door to direct African to America's shipping, and this was monumental. As Donnan records, these licenses were issued in blocks, typically favored to merchants or financiers close to the court. One such merchant was Laurens de Gouvenot, a Flemish trader granted a contract to import over 4,000 Africans between 1518 and 1520. In the contract, Donnan includes what the crown specified, and I quote, "Each slave shall be of good health and age sufficient for labor, and shall be marked accordingly upon inspection at point of embarkation." End quote. Marked, inspected, categorized. This language again is chilling, but essential. It reveals that by this point, Spain was not only tolerating slavery, it was regulating it. It wanted control over the quality of slaves brought to its colonies. The state was managing supply chains. Here's where Donnan's curation becomes particularly sharp. It includes not just royal decrees, but merchant correspondences. One such letter from a Spanish financier to a colonial administrator reads, and I quote, "Ensure that the Negroes delivered from Puerto Santo are received into safe custody, and that no delays occur at the docks, for each day incurs loss." End quote. In that single line, "each day incurs loss," we hear the full machinery of the slave economy at work. Enslaved people were not only property, they were perishable capital. The longer they remained in port, the more likely they were to become sick, escape, or die, and that meant diminished returns. Donnan also shows how this process reshaped the Atlantic. New ports rose to prominence, not just Seville and Lisbon, but Veracruz, Cartagena, San Juan, Havana, and Santo Domingo. These became nodes in a growing maritime network designed to extract labor and resources from colonized lands and feed them back to Europe. But let me focus on one of the earliest testing grounds for Spain's slave infrastructure, the island of Hispaniola. By 1520, Spanish colonists on the island were already depleting the indigenous population through forced labor, disease, and overexploitation. As mortality rose, so did petitions to the crown for African labor. Donnan includes a petition from colonial authorities in Santo Domingo, and it states, and I quote, "The Indians are weak and few. The Negroes are strong, industrious, and accustomed to toil. We pray your majesty to send more, lest our farms lie fallow and our gold lie hidden in the earth." End quote. This passage is worth unpacking. First, it openly reinforces racialized assumptions. Africans as biologically suited for enslavement, natives as fragile and unproductive. Second, it ties land fertility and gold mining to the availability of black labor, as if nature itself waited on African bondage to flourish. This kind of thinking would become foundational. It created the illusion that slavery was necessary, that economic development was impossible without it. And that illusion, backed by colonial governors and merchants, became policy. It also shaped urban life. In 1526, Donnan includes a census of San Juan, Puerto Rico, which lists 380 Spaniards, and 147 enslaved Africans. That's nearly one African for every 2 colonists. In other words, the colonies were becoming black spaces, though not in autonomy, but in labor, in presence, in daily visibility. Africans were building the very streets they would be barred from owning. They were constructing the cathedrals they would not be allowed to worship freely in. They were extracting gold they would never touch, but they were there. Their bodies and labor were becoming the material infrastructure of empire. Another revealing document in this chapter is a ship manifest from a voyage between Seville and Hispaniola. Donnan records the cargo, and I quote, 42 Negroes, 8 hogsheads of wine, 12 bolts of cloth, and 3 bales of iron tools, end quote. No distinction is made between people and products. Human beings appear as just one line on the invoice. In fact, in some documents, wine receives more detail, its year, quality, and origin, while the enslaved are listed only by number and gender. This too is important because it shows that slavery wasn't just physical violence, it was ontological violence, a stripping of identity, memory, and specificity. Invoices replaced names, inspections replaced ceremony, branding replaced ancestry. And still, through all of this, Donnan never editorializes. She doesn't lecture us about evil. She doesn't interpret motives. She simply provides the receipts, the raw, unvarnished materials of empire. And in doing so, I ask 2 questions. Can we listen to this and not feel implicated? Can we listen to these systems built with such intent and still call it accidental? As I close out this part, we begin to glimpse what Chapter 2 of Donnan's work is really about. The normalization of slavery as infrastructure, not as tragedy, not as scandal, but as necessary apparatus for empire. In Part 3, I'll take a closer look at the religious and racial narratives that help make this infrastructure morally sustainable, not just for the Spanish court, but for the colonial subjects who enacted it every day. Stay with me for Part 3, Theological Alibis and the Invention of Racial Fitness. Part 3, Theology, Alibis, and the Invention of Racial Fitness. At this point in Donnan's 2nd chapter, we've seen how Spain scaled the infrastructure of slavery, royal decrees, shipping routes, port authorities, and profit schemes. But none of it could have been endured, much less flourished, without a deeper foundation. And that foundation is belief. Belief, as we'll see, is what turned forced labor into civilizing missions and systemic brutality into divine order. In the early 16th century, Spain was not a secular empire. It was a sacred monarchy, bound to the Catholic Church, guided by its clergy, and obsessed with the idea that the conquest of new worlds was a religious duty. To expand Spain's dominion was to expand Christendom. This belief system was embedded directly into Spain's imperial logic. Conquest and conversion were one project. The crown ruled by divine right. Colonization was not just economic, it was salvation. So when Africans began arriving in large numbers to Spanish colonies, the question wasn't simply, should we use their labor? that question had already been answered. The more important question from the empire's view was, how do we explain this to ourselves? The answer: racial theology. Donnan includes selections from sermons and theological treatises that show how religious figures attempted to explain and justify the growing reliance on African slaves. One line from a Dominican friar in 1529 reads, and I quote, "The sons of Ham were cursed by Noah to be servants. It is thus ordained that they labor for the good of the world." End quote. This passage may sound familiar to some of you, and for some it may not. It was the so-called curse of Ham argument, a distorted biblical reading that became one of the most enduring religious justifications for black enslavement. Though the Bible never mentions skin color, colonial theologians claimed that Africans were descendants of Ham and therefore destined by God to serve. That idea, poisonous and false, would echo for centuries. It became a theological alibi for a material crime. And Donnan's records show it appearing in legal discourse as early as the 1530s. Here's what's remarkable. Even as Spain debated the ethics of indigenous slavery in the Valladolid debates of 1550, where Bartolomé de las Casas argued passionately for the native humanity, there was no formal debate over African enslavement. That silence speaks volumes. It wasn't oversight, it was consensus. Africans were deemed fit for enslavement, not despite their humanity, but because their humanity was redefined to suit empire. Spain did not need to see Africans as animals. It only needed to see them as providentially useful. And that was enough. Another letter Donnan includes from a Spanish bishop to the Council of the Indies, written in 1537, illustrates this point. And I quote, "These Negroes, though lacking the customs of Christians, are strong in body and discipline. With proper guidance, they may come to know our Lord and to serve both his will and our kingdom." I'll repeat that. These Negroes, though lacking the customs of the Christians, are strong in body and discipline. With proper guidance, they may come to know our Lord and to serve both his will and our kingdom. The enslaved are seen as raw material, physically strong, and according to the Spanish, spiritually ignorant and in need of guidance. Their purpose is dual: to serve the kingdom and to serve God. And this twofold purpose made slavery not just allowable, it made it righteous. This mindset created what we might call spiritual capitalism, a worldview in which the labor of the enslaved and the salvation of their souls were wrapped into a single imperial project. And just as Portugal had cloaked its slave trade in conversion, Spain went further, embedding Christian rituals into the process itself. Donnan includes instructions issued to slave ship captains, and I quote, "Let the Negroes be baptized before departure. Record their names given at sacrament." End quote. But of course, these were not true names. These were European Christian names: Antonio, Maria, Francisco, assigned at baptism and logged in port records. The original African names, identities, and languages were never written down. That erasure was part of the process. Conversion here wasn't salvation, it was substitution. A new name, a new master, and a new purpose. In the eyes of the Spanish crown and church, this transformation from African soil to Christian subject was a kind of cosmic upgrade. But in reality, It was the annihilation of identity, dressed up as mercy. So let me go deeper. The fusion of Catholic dogma and imperial governance created what we know as formulas of erasure. These are narratives that justify domination by reinterpreting violence as a virtue. We see this in the missionary letters that Donnan includes. A priest in Havana writes in 1541, and I quote, "Praise be that our Lord has brought us these sons of Ham to this island. Their suffering will be brief, but their reward eternal." End quote. That sentence, seemingly pious, is one of the most terrifying things I read in the second chapter of Donnan's collection. It offers the enslaved heaven as compensation for earthly torture and suffering. It transforms a profit-driven system into a spiritual transaction. Suffering here, salvation later. This theology of justified pain did more than ease colonial guilt. It trained the conscience of generations to come. It made slavery into a sacrifice, not a crime. It gave slavers not only political authority, but spiritual assurance. Even as enslaved people were worked to death in gold mines or sugar mills, their souls were cited as evidence of a benevolent empire. The lie was finally complete. This is the function of ideology, not to hide injustice, but to recode it, to make it legible as good, as godly, as necessary. And this is why Donnan's collection, while composed of what some may call dry documents, it is so powerful. Because between the legal clauses and port registers, we see a nude world being imagined, one where blackness becomes synonymous with labor and labor with salvation. The theological logic of slavery wasn't incidental to Spanish colonialism. It was foundational. And even today, the echoes of that logic remain. They remain in how we valorize suffering, how we criminalize black resistance, and how we divide labor and value based on race. But Donnan gives us the tools to hear those echoes for what they are: scripted justifications for structured harm. I'll repeat that. Scripted justifications for structured harm. In the next section, I'll examine the impact of these narratives on the lives of the enslaved, how Spanish colonies operationalized these beliefs, how enslaved people responded, and how Donnan's archives preserve the brutal day-to-day functions of sacred empire. Stay with me for part 4, Life Under Sacred Empire, Labor, Control, and Survival. As of now, we've explored how theology sanctified slavery and how infrastructure enabled it. But what did life actually look like for the enslaved under the Spanish Empire? What did the day-to-day rhythms of servitude mean in practice? In part 4, we leave behind the courtrooms and pulpits and step into the spaces where empire functioned: sugar mills, gold mines, urban homes, and plantation fields. Donnan's documents begin to detail this world, a world in which theology faded into the background noise and control became the central operating principle. One of the most illuminating records in Chapter 2 is a colonial ordinance issued by the Spanish crown to administrators in Santo Domingo, and it's dated 1530. The order outlines the expectations for the management of African laborers. And I quote, Let the Negroes be set to labor 6 days in 7, and the 7th be for the rest and sacrament. They are to be housed at night in lodgings kept under key. Any insubordination is to be punished by whipping, or in severe cases, iron. This is bureaucracy at its most violent. In just a few lines, we get the structure of labor, the logic of confinement, and the framework for punishment. So let me break this down. 6 days of labor, sun up to sundown, in harsh tropical environments. Whether in gold extraction or sugar cultivation, the work was grueling. Sugar in particular required near constant attention, cutting cane, feeding boiling vats, and carrying heavy loads in high heat. It was deadly labor, and enslaved Africans were seen as expendable. Not because they were unimportant, but because they were replaceable in the growing economy of forced labor. Next, we see the housing under lock and key. The ordinance assumes that even at rest, the enslaved must be confined. The nighttime is framed as a threat, darkness not as relief, but as risk. This spatial logic, this insistence on separation and surveillance, would become a blueprint for slave quarters, stockades, and eventually plantation barracks throughout the New World. Then, of course, there's the discipline. Insubordination is expected and met with immediate correction, whipping for minor offenses, iron for major ones. Iron here refers to shackles, collars, or branding instruments, tools designed not only to punish, but to humiliate and display dominance. What's crucial is that these ordinances weren't secret. They were part of official governance. And that's where Donnan's documentary method is so effective. By presenting these texts as everyday governance, mundane, procedural, she forces us to confront the banality of control. This wasn't chaos, it was order, structured, codified domination. In another document from Cartagena in 1535, Donnan includes a municipal regulation requiring enslaved persons to wear colored tunics identifying their owner's household. This was not only for record keeping, but for visual classification, a walking marker of ownership. And a colonial commentator writes, and I quote, "Let the blacks be attired in coarse cloth, marked in the back with the letter of the house, so that they not wander unknown." End quote. Even movement was suspicious. Even existence required labeling, and yet they survived. Despite this world of surveillance, punishment, and dehumanization, enslaved Africans resisted, adapted, and preserved culture. Donnan's archives, though largely composed of administrative texts, contain glimpses, just glimpses, of this resistance. One entry notes a ship captain's log upon arriving in San Juan, and I quote, "2 Negroes, newly arrived, refused food and called out in strange tongue. They were separated and whipped, and the priest did try to interpret, but they remained defiant." That phrase, "called out in strange tongue," is a powerful indicator. What the captain saw as strange or threatening may have been a religious incantation, a mourning ritual, or a decoded call for solidarity. Refusing food was a common form of resistance among captives, a way to reclaim agency over their own bodies, even in chains. Another administrator in Cuba wrote to the crown about what he called a spirit of rebellion in 1538, and I quote, "Certain Negroes speak with the Indians. They flee to the hills. They speak in secret. We fear they conspire to unsettle the colony." End quote. Here we see the fear of cross-cultural solidarity, the idea that Africans and indigenous peoples might find common cause. This wasn't paranoia, it was real. Across the Americas, maroon colonies, self-liberated settlements of escaped enslaved people, were forming in forests, swamps, and mountain regions. And Donnan's documents, even in their colonial perspective, testify to the uncontrollable will to be free. But I'm not trying to romanticize this. Life was extraordinarily difficult. The mortality rates among African slaves in Spanish colonies were high. Disease, overwork, and violence killed thousands. Women were exploited not only for labor, but for reproduction, forced into relationships designed to increase stock. Children born into slavery were claimed from birth, often baptized before they could even walk, recorded in ledgers as extensions of household wealth. And yet, even here, we find survival. Africans brought with them languages, cosmologies, culinary traditions, and musical forms. Some of these were suppressed, others adapted, blending with indigenous practices or Catholic rituals to create new expressions. What we call Afro-Caribbean spirituality today has its roots in these colonial crucibles. Though Donnan's focus in Chapter 2 is primarily on administrative records, the outlines of culture pulse beneath the surface. We see them in the margins: strange tongues, inexplicable dances, unauthorized gatherings. These were not anomalies, they were survival. And survival in a system designed for extinction is resistance. By the end of Chapter 2, you'll begin to understand the full scope of what Spain had set in motion. It wasn't just importing African labor, it was crafting a total system: spiritual, legal, spatial, and psychological. And yet the people at the bottom of that system were not only victims, they were agents of memory, vessels of culture, strategists of survival. As I enter the final section of this episode, I want to reflect on what all of this means, not just historically, but structurally. Because Donnan is not merely giving us the past, she is offering the architecture that continues to shape our present. So join me for Part 5, The Legacy of Structure, Spain's Imprint on the Atlantic World. As I bring this episode to a close, I arrive at the question that lingers behind every fact, every document, every silent figure on the ledger. What did Spain leave behind? Because if Portugal gave Europe the blueprint for the slave trade, Spain scaled it, refined it, and gave it structure that would outlive its own empire. And in Elizabeth Donnan's Chapter 2, we don't just see a moment in time, we see the template that others would follow. Spain was the first major colonial power to integrate African slavery into a new world economy, tied explicitly to sugar, gold, and religious conversion. The system Spain created, from the logistics of shipping to the licensing of traders to the registration of births and baptism of enslaved people, became models for other European empires: the Dutch, the French, the English, and eventually the Americans. So let me trace a few of these legacies. 1. The Asiento system. One of the clearest Spanish contributions to the architecture of slavery was the Asiento, a contract issued by the Crown that gave a private company or consortium exclusive rights to supply a fixed number of African slaves to Spanish colonies. Donnan includes early forms of these agreements in Chapter 2, showing how the Spanish monarchy sought to monetize slavery as a state-administered enterprise. This wasn't random profiteering, it was licensed cruelty. The asiento would eventually be outsourced to foreign companies, Dutch, French, and even English traders, cementing Spain's position as both client and architect of transatlantic bondage. This blending of royal control and corporate power set a precedent for centuries of imperial capitalism. 2. Religious infrastructure as imperial control. Spain's insistence that every enslaved person be baptized, renamed, and Catholicized before entering the colonies gave the church a formal role in legitimizing enslavement. It also gave the enslaved a dual status. They were property, but also subjects of the church. And folks, this created a very strange paradox. A baptized African might be denied freedom or recognition as a legal person, but still be expected to attend Mass, observe feast days, and submit to confession. Religion was not a shield from suffering. It was a script of obedience. And yet the spiritual language introduced by Spanish clergy would also be reinterpreted by the enslaved Africans to resist and preserve identity. Catholic saints were fused with Yoruba or Bantu deities. Holy days became secret meeting points. Syncretism emerged as subversion. 3. Legal silence and racial logic. Perhaps the most insidious of Spain's legacies was not what it said, but what it didn't say. As Donnan's documents show, the Spanish monarchy debated the humanity of native peoples. It issued laws protecting Indians from outright chattel slavery, though those protections were rarely enforced. But for Africans, there was no comparable debate. No law questioned the morality of their bondage. Their commodification was assumed. This silence created a racial hierarchy enshrined by omission, a logic of inferiority never stated outright, but enforced in every regulation, every whip, every ledger entry. And this unspoken code would travel across the Atlantic and mutate into the colonies of Britain, France, and beyond. That silence also extended to the enslaved themselves. In the hundreds of pages Donnan compiles, how many African voices did I actually hear? Almost none. And that's the final and perhaps most haunting legacy: the creation of a historical record in which the enslaved exist only as objects, never as narrators. They are counted, taxed, punished, traded, but rarely allowed to speak. Elizabeth Donnan doesn't invent their voices. She doesn't fill the gaps with fiction. She simply shows us the shape of the void. But that too is a kind of testimony, because what Donnan preserves is the system, the structure of erasure itself. And in preserving it, she invites us to name it, critique it, and push against it. Her work is not only a collection of documents, it is a map of silence, a guide to the absences we must interrogate. So I ask us all, what now? As I reflect on Chapter 2, we're left not only with the historical knowledge, but with responsibility. Spain's system, the asientos, the racial silences, the sacred justifications, did not die with its empire. They morphed, they migrated, and they endure in new forms. They endure in systems where black and brown bodies are categorized, confined, and commodified. They exist in systems where immigration policies that license exploitation while denying personhood. They exist in labor structures that replicate colonial hierarchies under the banner of development. This is not a stretch, ladies and gentlemen. It is a continuity. And so when I read Donnan today, I don't read her for what she captured. I read her for what she provokes in all of us. A reckoning, a confrontation, a refusal for us all to look away. Because to understand the beginnings of the slave trade, to really sit with them, is to recognize how empire engineers not only economies, but ideologies. It shapes what we value, who we forget, and how we remember. So I will close with this final thought, not from a monarch or a priest, but from the Afro-Caribbean poet Aimé Césaire, who once wrote, and I quote, "A civilization that proves incapable of solving the problems it creates is a decadent civilization. A civilization that chooses to close its eyes to its most crucial problems is a sick civilization." End quote. Donnan never tells us what to do with what she's preserved, but in her silence, she leaves a door open. And this podcast, the conversations I'm having with you, is one way of all of us walking through it. So in the next episode, I'll turn to the rise of private enterprise in the slave trade and how the English and Dutch empires began to compete for control of Atlantic human trafficking. Until then, I'm your host, Dat Work. This has been Slave Trade Narratives, the Elizabeth Donnan Project. Thank you for listening, and more importantly, thank you for remembering.